Hey folks, my name is Cameron. If you're new to this channel, then welcome. If you're not new to this channel, then welcome back. It is so wonderful to have you here. Really quick disclaimer before we get into the video. I'm doing this video series for my Girl Scout Gold Award where I work to educate people about the LGBTQ plus the community by using my own experiences and the experiences that others are willing to share with us and resources that they are able to provide with us. So today it's really exciting because we have another interview. This is Lea Ann. Would you care to introduce yourself, your name, your pronouns, what you do?
Sure. My name's Lea Ann Easton. I am she, her, me. I am a lawyer and I work in Portland, Oregon. And let's see. So I've been a lawyer for 30 some years now.
Cool.
Yep. And I know that so when I was in law school back in the day, so 1984, 85, there was a guy named Lon Mabon who was active opposing, back then was just LGBT issues. And there were lots of legal challenges going on to whether or not gay and lesbian people had any protection under the law from discrimination in employment, whether or not they could be school teachers. And for a while, there was a series of ballot measures whereby I can't think of the name of the organization anymore. But anyway, there was a series of ballot measures that tried to put limits on the kind of anti-discrimination laws that Oregon was trying to put into place to protect LGBT people from discrimination. And so we had like the No on 9, the No on 13 campaign. And ultimately, I think it was in 90, I always get this wrong, 93, 94, somewhere in there was a ballot measure that amended Oregon's constitution to limit marriage between a straight man and a straight woman. And it barely passed, but it still passed, and it was put into Oregon's constitution. And what that meant is that for matters of Oregon law, there was no possibility of adopting any sort of progressive laws that would allow LGBT members to marry each other. So, and I worked on that campaign, just in all those campaigns, just as a volunteer, primarily. It was before BRO was started, Basic Rights Oregon was even started. But the marriage campaign, I think, really helped solidify people that we needed a statewide organization to take on Lon Mabon and his friends and get the message out across Oregon, and start identifying members of the LGBT community to our neighbors and to people, and reach out to people that we knew, and start to try to get some political momentum coming back in the swinging in a different direction, I should say. Right. So it was about a decade of almost constant ballot measures. And enormous time spending, working phones, going door to door, getting doors slammed in your face, all sorts of stuff. Yeah. So it was it was hard time, but important work, I think.
Yeah, it sounds, when I think about Oregon's history, we're not known for being the most open state, dating back to like all of the really just blatant racism that our state had, especially against Black folks. And just discrimination in general. And I know that Portland's supposed to be known as super liberal like town that is like super open to people of minorities, but there's some deep roots that go back to the discrimination that minorities face every day in Oregon. And I'm really thankful for the work that you've done to help make it a safer place for people like me.
Well, it's I think we all stand on somebody else's shoulders, and so people did a lot of work before I hit the streets working on these issues as well. So it all goes back to people who were there before us and started the conversation and started showing up and talking about these issues and recognize the importance for future generations.
Right.
And also just sort of recognizing historically that there are a lot of cultures and communities where LGBTQ people were recognized as spiritual leaders or leaders within those communities, and it wasn't an issue. It's just like race was often not an issue across the world until, until governments or people decided to start using it as a way to separate us. So
Yeah.
I think at least some of my reading of history suggests that when we start labeling people, it becomes a way to for governments to control us. So
yeah, I think that's.
So it's
Sorry.
It's been, I think it's just going to be an ongoing, because every time we turn a corner, then those people that are afraid become afraid of something new and ask and push their arguments in a slightly different way. So it's sort of, sometimes it just feels like a big decades old chess game that we're playing, trying to stay one move ahead.
I love that. Yeah.
Yep.
But it's just, you get, new leg ups, and it's because of the people who are like you, who are fighting those battles. So and if this video is basically about Basic Rights Oregon and your work with Basic Rights Oregon, since I've seen it as a resource for specific folks. So as I understand it, I'm looking down because my questions are on my phone.
Okay.
But so as I understand it, you worked /partnered / volunteer with Basic Rights Oregon. What does that look like?
Well, the most recent thing it looked like for me was in 2014. I should look. Yeah, it was 2014, 13-14. Basic Rights Oregon was preparing to mount a campaign to repeal the ban on same-sex marriage and remove that provision in the Oregon Constitution that limited marriage to a man and a woman under state law. And a year or so before, there was a tax case that came down from the United States Supreme Court, and it really changed the legal framework under which the equal protection provision of the United States Constitution was looking at the arguments being made for why it was okay to discriminate against same-sex couples. And in that case, a couple that had been together for 45 years, one of them died, and they had lived together and combined their resources and assets for their entire partnered life, but they weren't able to get married until late in life. And when one of them died, their surviving partner was looking at inheritance tax, death tax. I think it was like $300,000. And so ultimately, an LGBT lawyer in New York City agreed to represent the surviving spouse in challenging the federal government and this claim that they could treat same-sex couples differently under the tax code and under inheritance. And ultimately it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that there's no rational basis for that discrimination when in fact it just was blatant discrimination under the federal Constitution. And so back here in Oregon, at that time, Basic Rights Oregon was preparing this huge campaign as part of a larger national campaign to have a ballot measure to repeal Oregon's ban. And I had been to a couple of their meetings and listened to some of the arguments and was looking at whether I agreed with their strategy. And ultimately at that time, I decided that they were going to spend $12 million on And they had been working on this issue for probably a decade at that point. So ever since the ban went in, BRO had been working aggressively against it and trying to come up with a legal strategy to undo it. And the political times in 2012, 13 were favorable to that kind of an effort. And the polling looked like it would be close, but that likely the ballot measure would have been successful. But at the same time, there's a growing number of people and people that I knew and were talking to that were really ticked off about having to vote, having to let other people vote on whether or not we had constitutional rights under the federal or state constitution.
Right.
And in my work as an attorney, I do some federal court litigation, and I had heard about BRO's campaign, political campaign, and I really had urged them to consider filing litigation instead as a way to challenge Oregon's constitutional ban, especially in light of the Supreme Court's decision earlier that year. And at some time in the summer of 13, I heard there's an attorney in Portland that had a couple of clients that wanted to file a private lawsuit challenging the state's ban, and that he had already been in contact with Oregon Attorney General Ellen Rosenblum and had some conversations with her about the challenge and what it would look like. And so there's already some efforts being made. Ultimately, I connected with that attorney, and he and I represented two different couples and filed this lawsuit in federal court in Eugene, challenging Oregon's ban on same-sex marriage. Prior to the litigation, right before we filed it, we had a meeting with BRO's legal team and their executive director, and they told us at that time they wanted to move forward with the political campaign to have a ballot measure on the ballot. And so, because I'm a lawyer and because I had clients who were giving me direction to go ahead with the litigation, we filed our lawsuit, filed it in late fall of 2014. And about 2 weeks after we filed our complaint, BRO and some private individuals filed a separate lawsuit alleging the same arguments that we're making as to why the campaign by the court should overturn Oregon's ban on same-sex marriage. And ultimately, because of the way the rules of the legal system work, our litigation got combined into one big lawsuit.
Oh.
And so for about 6 months, might have been about 6 months, we were sort of having coordination of litigation strategies, having hearings at the same time, lots of phone calls, lots of planning about deadlines and how we're going to meet those deadlines. And so ultimately, it was sort of a unusual case because it turned out that the state of Oregon, through the Attorney General office, actually agreed with our legal analysis. And so even though we had to file a lawsuit and we had to have some hearings on it, ultimately we prevailed. And so in May of 2014, the district court in Oregon issued a decision basically saying that Oregon's ban on same-sex marriage was unconstitutional under the federal constitution, violated equal protection provisions of the federal constitution, and so we won. And in the days leading up to that decision, a group of conservative attorneys representing an anti-LGBT group filed a motion to intervene in these cases. And so we had to have a hearing as to whether or not they had what's called legal standing. So whether or not they had the right to come to be part of our litigation and to argue against our position. And ultimately, we had a fairly tense hearing on that in front of Judge McShane in Eugene. And the result of that is that their motion to intervene was denied. Yep. And then in the course of 24 hours, they were pursuing a motion with the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to appeal that decision. And then when that was denied, they asked for an en banc hearing, and then they filed a motion they petitioned for review by the United States Supreme Court.
Wow,
and so in the course of, so in the course of 3 weeks, I think we filed 4 or 5 different legal briefs, some on behalf of my own clients and some jointly with BRO and their legal team. But it was a time in terms of how fast it moved. But it was sort of interesting because we filed in October, and by the time we got our decision in May, I think 13 or 14 other states, federal courts had issued decisions overturning bans on same-sex marriage. And so it was just moving very, very quickly, sort of at a speed at which I don't think anybody anticipated. I certainly thought we'd be doing with the litigation for at least a year or two, and we were essentially done in 4 or 5 months, which that doesn't sound like, that might not sound very fast, but in terms of federal court litigation, that is like lightning speed. Federal courts just don't usually answer that quickly, and then, so all those cases were going forward, and then the Ogenfeld, I never get that name right, but the case out of Ohio that ended up in the United States Supreme Court got decided, that very same summer, and it was just like, boom, we're done.
Yeah.
So just in a very short period of time, really, in terms of how legal change happens in this country, within probably a 4 or 5 year period of time, we went through having a majority of the states having bans on same-sex marriage to now, as a matter of federal law, it's no longer permitted. So it was rocket fast in terms of that kind of legal strategy moving forward, and the stars appeared to have lined up.
I'm so thankful that they did.
Yeah. Well, I think a good part of it was all the work that BRO and other organizations across the country had done when these bans on gay marriage happened in the late 80s and 90s, where that became a priority for these different organizations. BRO, that was their mission for at least a decade, maybe longer. And so when you think about it, in October of 2013, BRO was going to have a $12 million campaign against, and get it on the ballot in Oregon, and then fight it on the ballot in Oregon. And they went from that to dropping that campaign, switching to a legal strategy to challenge the ban.
Right.
And then 7 months later, basically they won their argument. They won the day. And so here's this organization that had this whole system set up to work on the gay marriage issue, and all of a sudden there were still some issues, but it wasn't the driving legal issue. It was their primary objective anymore.
Yes. Oh, and so you used what was the word? Use the word mission in like a few sentences ago. So Basic Rights Oregon, I have heard of it through the grapevine, and them doing stuff for people in minority groups, but it seems like the mission is a lot more just started with gay rights to start with. What does their mission, what did their mission look like, and what does it look like now?
So my understanding of it is when it started, it was really focused on identifying and working on state law and local government issues facing LGBT people. So both in the workplace, in terms of discrimination in the workplace, discrimination in housing, all sorts of discrimination issues that LGBT people faced, because there's no protection for us under state or federal anti-discrimination statutes. And so a lot of their work initially was, one, fighting the ballot measures that I talked about earlier, but also working at a state policy level and with local governments to incorporate and get statutes in place to add LGBT people as part of the group of protected classes under anti-discrimination statutes. and they did a lot of education work, a lot of training. And then when the whole ban on same-sex marriage became sort of the political issue in the 90s through the early early 2000s, that became one of their major priority issues, I guess, or, really to first, there's a group of people that basically helped form BRO that really got focused on trying to defeat the ballot measure that changed Oregon law to make it part of our Constitution that marriage could only be between a man and a woman. And then in the decades after that, they're focused on trying to undo that. At the same time, they're also doing these advocacy issues on just protection and making sure that LGBT people were treated fairly in the workplace and kids were treated fairly in the school place and all those sorts of things. So it's really been, I think, a lot of policy work, a lot of coordination, a lot of outreach. And I think after this, the marriage issue got solved. I think I know that they had to do a lot of, I don't know if soul searching is the right word, but the executive director who had sort of led the organization for a long time and had led that battle needed a break. And also the issue she really was focused on was the marriage issue. And so the board and the staff had to come together and recognize that now there's a changing political environment. There are different issues that are important. It's and taking a more expansive, looking at what are the issues facing sexual minorities in Oregon, and it's the LGBT, we had queer, so LGBTQ, but then what became very apparent is, at least from my understanding, has been that the trans issues have become super important issues because trans was even a hidden minority within the LGBTQ community, and so Basic Rights Oregon has made that also as one of their priorities, and working again on policy issues, working on making sure that trans members of our community have protections and have recognition in terms of anti-discrimination, work on training, offering workplace training, doing training for different groups, and really trying to support everybody in our communities. And it's been I think it's been, I know it was a pretty big shift for them, but the core work, I think, has still been working to make sure that members of the sexual minority community are safe, have protection under the statutes, and if necessary, be willing to help litigate and in order to make sure that people are treated fairly and equally,
right,
and have the right to and have the right to their identity.
So what I'm hearing, I think I'm hearing you say, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
What I'm hearing you say is that the beginning, when you were working with Basic Rights Oregon through the 80s and the 90s, that the main goal was making sure that same-sex marriage was something that was able to happen specifically in Oregon. That was something that they were working on legally, correct?
Well, no, in the 80s and 90s, it was more protecting sexual. Yeah. So the 2013 era, after that, was when the marriage issue was on the forefront.
Right. Okay. Got that. That was the little bit stuff. And then now they, like you said, had to do a little bit of soul searching, had to find, like, since they achieved that goal, what's the next goal? What else can they achieve? And so they're working more towards, of course, like helping same-sex partners and educating people, and also now bringing in the trans community of the LGBTQ plus community to make sure that discrimination lessens. Is that what I mean?
Yes, that's what you're hearing. And
cool.
I think it's really interesting. It's still really important work, and there's still a lot of work to be done, as we all know. So it's still critically important work, and there's still so many places where LGBT, I can't even say it.
I know what you mean.
Sexual minorities don't feel safe living where they're living, and they don't feel safe. They can't express themselves fully in their community. And so it's also trying to make sure that especially younger people, they know that there's resources out there for them.
Right.
You know, because
Also,
people with gray hair like me, I mean, we sort of lived through a different era, but I mean now, I mean even though the issues are not the same, it's still so hard on there's still a lot of isolation. There's still people and young kids and young people still who are socially isolated, and that's part of the work that they're doing as well.
yeah.
And you know, we all know the suicide rate, self-harm, depression, substance abuse issues are still higher proportionally in our communities than in other, than in other sectors of our community. So, you know, there's a lot of issues out there that still need basic rights and still need their work.
Yeah, I mean, talk about self-isolation right now. I mean, COVID. That's lovely.
Yeah.
We love that. But you mentioned like resources, and it kind of made me think, because I saw lots of like legal resources within PRO, but I was wondering like what specific types of resources were you mentioning?
Well, they've been doing basic rights. Oregon historically has worked with some mental health community providers to help make sure that mental health services are available to young people or to members of the mental health community, and that they have caseworkers who are trained to deal with LGBTQ issues and trans issues, and I know at one point there was some work being done within the juvenile justice system, and BRO was one of the entities that was reached out to help provide training within that system for court counselors, for juvenile counselors to be able to work with their clients in a sensitive way and help identify those issues, so that if that was part of the issue, the issues going on with their particular client, they could help marshal resources for it. I mean, they still do a lot of training both in the workplace, in schools, and different community resources. The big problem we have across this country, and I think it's becoming particularly acute in Oregon, is just the lack of mental health services, the lack of community support services. And it's getting tougher and tougher. And with our current environment, with wildfires and COVID, people are getting isolated and from their communities and their friends, and at the same time, the government doesn't have the resources available.
Right. Or maybe not even willing to make those resources available.
Yeah, I think they're willing. I think it's just how do you fund them? Where do the money comes from for that? If you're, the COVID response that the government's had to put forward, all the state, local, all the infrastructure stuff for that, and now with the wildfires on top of it, it's just state resources and federal resources are stretched pretty thin. And in this current federal administration, we don't have a good friend in that position right now. And these aren't issues that are important to the administration. And in the past, they have been issues that were more important to the previous administration. And so part of what we've seen since our current administration came in is that there's been a decrease in dollars for mental health. There's been a decrease in, kinds of programs that are funded by the federal government for LGBTQ community members. And there's been some rollback of some of the protections, especially for trans members. It's just getting harder and harder, I think.
Yeah.
At least that's what it seems like from what I'm reading and what I'm hearing from folks.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in Oregon, but just nationally in terms of where the funds come from.
Yeah.
So
I'm glad that there are resources for people in our community, not even just young people, but also people of all ages. And it seems like it's really a cool environment because there are people in the community that are helping their own community members. I mean, at least that's what I find power in doing this project, is that I'm able to talk to people like you and then spread information. try to educate
Mhm.
myself as I try to educate others, you know.
Yeah.
I think,
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, I think that your project is a great example.
oh, thank you.
I just said your project is a great example of people's ability to, use the resources we have to get messages out and let people know that there's places to go to and things they can do and people that can help them.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I have one last question, since some of them we've just talked about, just like through
Okay.
dialogue, which has been really awesome.
Okay.
But I was wondering, if if you learned anything, like what would you want to share about like your experiences with BRO?
Uh, hmm. Well, that's a hard question. I think the biggest, well, I mean, it was a bit of a roller coaster ride. It's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, but I think one of the things that became really clear is that um, oftentimes people have they think there's a different, we take different paths. Well, we might have a different path, but we have the same goal. And sometimes if you sit down and really take the time to communicate with with the people working towards that same goal, um, it turns out your path can be the same,
Right.
and that there's value in that. There's value in being able to, you know, um, use resources, raise resources for that one goal as opposed to having competing goals. And that's I think what happened, especially with the marriage case. It just was. It's not that our goal was different, it's just how we thought we were going to get there was different. And ultimately, we both ended up on the same path on that goal, and we were able to prevail.
Yeah,
And I met some really great people along the way too.
didn't mean to interrupt you, sorry.
No, it's okay.
I heard something earlier about like there's the conductor, there's the train, and then there's the tracks. And what's the
Yeah,
most important is the tracks because it's taking you to where you want to go, right? So I thought, like
that
it's
seems
cool
like it.
to have a goal.
You get to stay on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, yep,
Gotta have all three elements, but like
yep.
good to have that goal in mind.
Yeah, it's good to have the goal. It's good to know. It's also good to help. I think it also really made it clear, at least for me, to sit down and really think about what was I willing to do and what could I do and how could I best help. And
Yeah.
so, that was the way I could best help at that moment.
Yeah. Well, thank
So
you so much for your work in our community, and thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with me.
you're welcome. This is very enjoyable.
Oh, good.
Take care.
I'm glad.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.